After knowing the nature of variables according to their statistical type, the next question is how these variables are used in a study's design to answer the research questions. Hi, I am Ma'am Balbio. Join me in the second part of our discussion on the classifications of variables. In quantitative research, one important thing you have to focus on at the start of your study is to determine the variables involved in your study. This time, we will talk about the classification of variables by role. Let us begin with the basic type of variables under experimental research. Classification of variables by role under experimental research, independent variable and dependent variable. The independent variable is the assumed cost of a problem. It is an assumed reason for any change or variation in the dependent variable. This variable is usually manipulated in an experiment. Thus, it is called manipulated or explanatory variable. The dependent variable is the assumed effect of another variable. This variable is usually affected by the manipulation of the independent variable. Usually, dependent variable is the problem itself. They are also called response or predicted variable. Let's have one example and see if you will be able to identify and classify the variables. Google Classroom as a tool to enhance the student's academic performance. What are the variables? The variables are Google Classroom and students' academic performance. Google Classroom as one method of conducting asynchronous classes is the independent variable, while the student's academic performance is the dependent variable. Using a right arrow to connect the two variables, we can show that the Google Classroom as a method of learning can affect the student's academic performance. When you conduct an experimental research, you are looking to see if the independent variable has an effect on the dependent variable. But there are times that it is a little more complicated than that. Sometimes there are other variables, perhaps ones that never cross your mind, might influence the outcome of an experiment. These undesirable variables are called extraneous variables. Extraneous variables are those factors in the research environment which may have an effect on the dependent variable, but which are not controlled. They are dangerous because they may damage the study's validity, making it impossible to know whether the effects were caused by the independent variable. If they cannot be controlled, then extraneous variables must at least be taken into considerations when interpreting results. Let's say we want to know if the lesson videos increases students' understanding in practical research too. The independent variable is the lesson videos, while the dependent variable is the student's performance in practical research too. Extraneous variables could be the student's prior knowledge in research. There are cases when the independent and dependent variables are significantly related, but it is not proven that the independent variable is directly causing the dependent variable to behave as it does. When it happens, researchers then hypothesize what other variables could be influencing the relationship, or how a variable might intervene between these two variables. And so, the next type of variable we will take up is the intervening variable. Intervening variables cannot be observed in an experiment. That is why they are hypothetical. They are not real variables. They cannot be measured, like motivation, personality, intelligence, or attitude. It is important we know this because this intervening variable might weaken or strengthen the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. In the study on the impact of poverty to life expectancy, the researcher would like to know if poverty can mean a shorter lifespan. One may argue that lack of access to healthcare as one cause of shorter longevity. In this case, we may consider lack of access to healthcare an intervening variable. We go now in the classification of variables by role under non-experimental research. We have predictor and criterion variable. Let us begin with the predictor variable. In statistical modeling, the predictor variable is analogous to an independent variable. It is used to predict an outcome, which is the criterion variable. One of the main differences between independent-dependent and criterion predictor variables is the concept of causation. You can manipulate the independent variables in experimental research and imply that manipulation causes some kind of change in the dependent variable. However, in statistical modeling, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. All the correlation means is that there is some relationship between the two variables. Therefore, a change in the predictor variable may correlate with a change in the criterion variable, but it does not mean the change caused anything. A criterion variable is another name for a dependent variable. It works almost similar to dependent variable. It is also called a response variable. However, the terms aren't exactly interchangeable. A criterion variable is usually only used in non-experimental situations. For example, in statistical modeling applications like multiple regression and canonical correlation, which use existing experimental data to make predictions. So, if you are conducting experimental research, use the terms independent variable and dependent variable. When you perform further studies on that experimental data, in other words, non-experimental research like correlation, the terms criterion and predictor variables should be used. Example: the effects of television dramas to young viewers. What are the variables? The first variable is if the young viewers are watching television dramas, or it can also be the television dramas the young viewers are watching. And the second variable is its effects to the young viewers. Which of the two is the predictor and the criterion? The predictor variable is the television dramas, and the criterion variable is the effects to young viewers. The right arrow connecting the two implies that the television dramas predict the values of the effects to young viewers. To summarize, classification of variables by role. Under experimental, we have independent and dependent variable. Under non-experimental research, we have predictor and criterion variable. This is the end of our discussion on the variables used in research. I hope you will be able to correctly identify and classify your research variables. God bless. Happy learning.